So this whole series has been about this idea of emptiness as a way into experiencing more depth of life, more joy, as a way of experiencing God. The season of Epiphany that we are in for another couple of weeks, but we'll finish up the series today that I've been doing. This idea of Epiphany, how is God revealed? How is God become known to us in certain moments? Epiphany was centered around the discovery of the wise men, the discovery of the baby Jesus, the three wise men, the magi in that story, and the incarnation of God in Jesus. So when we're thinking about Epiphany, we're thinking about where these moments come forth, where these moments of God moments, they rise. And as I've often said in here, you encounter people, you have these great moments with people that you encounter, and they don't happen very often, but you have these great moments where suddenly you seem to be in simpatico, you seem to be thinking in the same frame of reference. You suddenly are sharing something with someone, they share something back, you're hearing your own story as you're hearing something back to you, and you suddenly realize your life is bigger than you thought it was. And you realize their life is bigger than you thought it was, and there's all this unknown that suddenly becomes known, and you feel bigger for it. You feel more whole for it, and I often say that we think of these as these special moments, and someone will say, that's a God moment, but I often remind ourselves that all moments are God moments, right? We live and move and have our being in God. It's all present. It's all fertile soil. So for this last Sunday in this series, I'm going to play with a series of stories and just kind of think with you some ideas about how we empty enough to get to this place of wisdom. But I don't want you to think of wisdom as, I know you were sharing some great little proverbs, and I love proverbs, and I love pithy sayings and such. They're often very helpful for me as I make my way and navigate in different circumstances, right? What was it? You came up and said to me, the unexamined life is not worth living. And then I said, sometimes the examined life doesn't make any sense. Right? So, I mean, you got yin and yang, you got opposites. That's helpful, but oftentimes Proverbs are all about sort of the individual. There's something more to wisdom than simply the individual instructions for life. So I looked it up, of course, and the word wise means path. As a noun, it means a way. But as a verb, it means to see. So wisdom is really to see a way. So I want to think with you about how we see a way towards this idea of love, how we connect with this heart of our ground of being that is love. Gamble Rogers, one of my favorite storytellers that I grew up with. Back in the 80s when I got into storytelling in earnest, there was this wonderful guitarist, fingerstyle, Marty Travis kind of picker, who would play, kind of like I like to do, talking blues, what you'd say, and he would play while he's talking and telling stories. And he was well known for this style. He was a phenomenal guitarist, and he told sort of homespun stories of growing up in his little town in Florida. And he tells a story about how he once went to his mom, and he was a kid, and he said, Mom, how do I get wisdom? And she said, Gamble, wisdom comes from knowledge. And he says, well, Mama, how do I get knowledge? She says, well, Gamble, you get knowledge from experience. He says, what's experience? She said, never mind. So he went where he wasn't ever supposed to go. He went down to the Two Bits Tap and Grocery, which was down in the middle of town. They had a little loading dock to the side, and that's where the philosophers would sit. And so he walked up to some of the old guys one day, and he said, what's experience? And one of the guys blurted out, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. And Gamble said, I gave up looking for experience. There's this way of seeing that is part of who we are already. And sometimes experience can get in the way, and sometimes ideas can get in the way, but there's something about emptying, opening, that allows us to connect to that. I was reading some things about Teilhard de Chardin. Some of you know Desjardins, a 20th century French philosopher, scientist, and theologian. He grew up around the turn of the 20th century, right? So as a young adult, he was growing up through the early 1900s, which also was sort of the thrust of this new idea, evolution. Now, every 2 to 3, 4, even 500 years, there are these hallmark insights, these enlightenment periods. We suddenly realize we're no longer the center of the universe. It's the solar system is heliocentric and not geocentric. And then now, all of a sudden, with evolution, we suddenly have this idea that we are not the center of creation, that story is being challenged now by evolution. So now what do we make out of evolution? If God isn't the one who in 7 days created everything, how do we make sense? Well, now it was a controversial idea, right? I mean, Darwinism was very controversial, evolution a very controversial theory, and even to this day, people still struggle with the ideas of it somehow. But Desjardins was fascinated by it because where he was in his own life was trying to figure out who God is and what God is. And being a philosopher, he was always asking questions. But being a scientist, he was always observing. And one of the things that he began to notice in the context of evolution and this new theory was that scientists were discovering how life breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And floating around in science was this idea that there are all of these atomized realities that just get smaller and smaller that we can't even perceive now. There's something underneath all of that we don't even know. But we're discovering how all of these granulations and particles and pieces somehow come together and move into something else. What is that? So in his mind, he came up with this idea. He had just read a book by Henri Bergson, another scientist and philosopher who wrote a book called The Creative Evolution. And he came up with this idea that what moves everything in life is this force of creativity, what he called this force of love. And he said it's not sentimentality, it's not sentimentalism, it's not romanticism, all of these valid emotions and affects and important experiences, but love is something, he said, at the very core of our being. It is something more than what we simply express to one another. It is something at the very heart of life. He said, love is a geophysical force at the heart of life that seeks some kind of connection to create something more out of the cosmos. I'm reminded of Genesis 1, right? God looked over the void and pulled out of the void light. God created out of nothingness. John, in the beginning was the Word. This idea of spoken into being. All of these notions of what is at the core of life and bringing things together, Desjardins said it was love is the force. There's an ancient Islamic text. I don't usually quote many Islamic texts in here, but there's an ancient Islamic text that comes out of the Sufi tradition that I read recently that really, it reminded me of Matthew 6:33, which is what we began this series with. Remember? Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things will be added unto you. Where's the kingdom of heaven? Jesus said the kingdom is already in your midst. How do we seek it? So this Islamic text is really fascinating. It says, I was hidden like a treasure, and I longed to be found. And so I created the earth and all of its inhabitants. I am a treasure hidden, and I long to be found. All of the speeches and all of the tongues and all of the defenses and all the exhortations, prophecy, speech, all of these things fall away, right? Paul says, but the one thing that seems to endure and last is this idea of love. What did Rovelli say? You remember Carlo Rovelli I mentioned last week, the scientist, the astrophysicist? He said, if you look at how atoms come together, electrons, you don't see anything until it interacts, and then it comes real. All reality, he said, is interaction. I think there's something here with all of this. I think there's something for us to really think about, this idea of how love abides and how we connect with love. But this is what I want to share with you in a few stories, the idea of how do we connect with love? How does emptiness have anything to do with connecting with this way to see in life? And so I want to share with you a couple of quick little stories. We'll call it the art of creating ourselves. So the first one is this idea when a professor is working in his office and a student comes in. he's really wanting to study with this professor for an advanced project. So he says, I'm really ready for this. I've been really working on my social psychology. I'm ready to do this social psych experiment. I'm just thinking of Todd here, so that just came to mind. I'm thinking of social psych experiment, and I'm ready. You're advanced in this theme, in this area, and I want to study under you. I have really been working hard. I know exactly what I need to do next. I am in control of this thing. And so the professor sits the student down and says, really? And he walks over, grabs up a pot of coffee, and puts it down on the table with the cup, and then puts a cup by himself, and then he pours his cup, and then he goes over to the student, and he starts pouring his cup, and he continues to pour the cup until the coffee is spilling over the cup and onto the saucer and spilling onto the table, and the student jumps back and says, Professor, what are you doing? And he looks at the student and says, come to me with an empty cup mind, and then I'll be ready to teach you. Sometimes the art of emptiness begins with the art of naivete. Begins with the erasure of assumptions. I didn't realize that Johnny Cash was terrified of singing as a soloist. Did you all know that? For years and years and years, Johnny Cash played with his band. He went to prisons, he went to festivals, he went to stadiums, he played with the band. Then in the 1990s, he'd kind of fallen away. Maybe you remember that. He had a resurgence, kind of a resurrection of interest in him. But you remember what he did at that point? He was playing solo. And he was doing solo albums. One of his producers, Rick Rubin, was with him one day, and he invited him to come into his studio, and he says, I don't want the band, I just want you, your guitar, and a microphone, start singing. And as he listened to Johnny Cash sing by himself, something was revealed to him. And he says, I want you to play at the Viper Room, and he set up a date, and he says, you're going to do it as a solo act. Johnny Cash was terrified. He said it was one of the scariest moments in his life. He had never sung by himself. For years and years and years, he'd had the band with him. He figured the band was part of who he was, but there he was on the microphone, a sold-out room, just him and the guitar. He said he shook through the first song. But by the time he'd finished, people are still talking about how they saw something completely amazing that night. Sometimes the art of making ourselves involves the art of elimination. You remember Mark Twain when he said, I would have written you a shorter letter if I'd taken more time. Or we think of Michelangelo when he's looking at the rock and he's dragging the rock behind him and he's saying, David's waiting to break out of here. What is it in our lives that sometimes we need to eliminate, we need to remove in order to be present to love that's at the heart of our being? One of my favorite stories is this story from the Zen tradition. Some of you remember it, but I'm going to tell it because I haven't told it in here in a long, long time. There was a farmer who had a horse. The horse ran off one afternoon. It was his only horse. The neighbors came around and said, this is terrible. You've lost your only horse. And he said, could be bad, could be good. Who knows? Next day, the horse came back with a stallion. The neighbors came up and said, good fortune to you. Look at this. I mean, how the fates must be looking kindly upon you. This is amazing. And the farmer looked up and shrugged and said, could be good, could be bad. Who knows? The next few days, the farmer's son was helping him break that new stallion when the stallion bucked him and the son broke his leg. Neighbors came around and said, this is terrible. Your son's broken his leg now. He won't be able to help you with the horses. The farmer said, could be good, could be bad. Who knows? A few weeks later, the emperor of the region conscripted all of the young men to go off to battle, fight a war with the neighboring country. The neighbors came up to the farmer whose son couldn't go off to battle because of his broken leg. They said, you must be very happy. You must be very proud. Your son is spared. And the farmer smiled and said, could be bad, could be good. Who knows? There was once a man who lived on a mountain who had a small hut at the top of a mountain. One day, thieves came and broke into the mountain. Into the hut. They stole everything he had. And then they looked at him, because he didn't have very much. He was a simple man. And they said, give us something else. And he said, I don't have much else, but I'll give you my clothes. So he gave him his clothes, even the clothes off his back. The thieves took the clothing, they took whatever they could find, and they bagged it up, and they started down the hill as the sun had set, the night had come on, and the moon had begun to rise. And as the man stood there and watched the thieves go back down the mountain path with all of his stuff, he smiled and he said, wait, come back. I could have given you a view of this beautiful moon. The art of the big view. So story number 4. Some of you are sitting there going like, I'm not sure where this is going. You going to ever land this plane? Some of you know I don't land planes very often. I usually keep them flying around in the sky so you can see them. I used to joke about my brother. My brother's a genius. My brother was once invited by 60 Minutes to come and talk on the show when they were doing a segment on fathers and daughters doing special kinds of activities together. This was back in the late 80s. My brother was a genius. He was into rocketry, competitive rocketry, where they build 10, 12-foot rockets and go out across the country and have these competitions. My niece, his daughter, was with him. They were a team together. So they did an interview on him. They asked him, would you mind sending us a little explanation of what this is? He sent him a 65-page document that he'd written. Sometimes people, when they'd say, in a family, when they'd say when my brother was going to call, and this is my older brother, when they'd say he's calling because he was living in Minnesota, and it was a birthday party, they'd say, who wants to talk to him? And we'd all put our hands up. If you ever asked Buzzy a question and you wanted to know one simple thing, like, why does a plane fly? It would take hours. And sometimes the plane would just go up and up and up and up when he was describing something. You'd ask a simple little question, maybe how to solve a math problem, and the plane would just go up and up and up, and pretty soon the conversation was out of sight, and you had no idea what he was talking about. And by then, most of everybody would give up. And then I tried it one time. We were having a beer or two, and we were just talking about some things, and I just listened to him. And I listened to him for about 2 hours. And after about 2 hours, the plane came back down out of the clouds. And he landed it. And I thought, he's just looking for the big picture. He's just seeing how it all fits together. The art of the big view. So number 6, David Letterman had Warren Zevon on his show once. And Warren Zevon was the guitarist and singer-songwriter. Some of y'all remember he wrote the Werewolves of London. He contracted cancer, and he was being interviewed shortly after he'd been diagnosed with cancer. And David Letterman asked him this strange question. He said, Warren, what can you tell me about life now that probably is something I don't know? And Warren smiled but got serious and said, I know how important a sandwich tastes. The art of gratitude. Story number 7. Dorothy Day. You know Dorothy Day? Dorothy Day was a wonderful social activist, political activist, a Catholic. She had a messy life. She was actually kind of a messed up person in many ways, in a number of relationships, struggled with her own sense of self-worth and identity, but she was compassionate to a fault and fought for other people's rights and for workers' unions and for uniting communities and for poverty. In fact, that the Catholic Church even now is put her forth now. She's been dead for 30 years almost, but she's now been put forth for canonization as a saint. But she's considered one of their patron servants. The interesting thing about Dorothy Day, when they interviewed her and they asked her about what was it that really kicked this whole thing off for her, she said, when I was a kid, my father moved to San Francisco to get a new job with a newspaper there. He was a journalist. She said, I was there in 2009 with the San Francisco earthquake. It was overwhelming. But she said, when I went outside after all the rubble had settled, the first thing I noticed that struck me was all of the people from all walks of life coming out of everywhere to work together to help. And the first question that came to my mind, she said, why isn't this all the time? Why aren't we like this all the time? the art of the question. So last story. When I was in Ireland on a cycling trip, I went out to the edge of the Dingle Peninsula, which is of Glencullen Peninsula, which is on the very northwest corner of Ireland. And I stayed for a week. I'd been cycling for a month. I stayed for a week, and I went to the pub. And the pub was where the community gathered. It wasn't just where people came to drink, but it was also where people came to eat in these small towns. It was where the families sometimes would come together. And you'd listen to traditional music, and you'd sit around, and there'd be tourists present. If you stuck around long enough, not just to hear what you expected, right? You hear what you expect. You come for Irish music, and they know it, and they're playing, and everyone's sort of wearing the mask. But you stay long enough, and a lot of the tourists leave, or some of them become less tourist and more part of the community, more attentive. And after a while, what would happen is you would see the locals start to encourage one another to stand up at the bar and to sing a song. And a lot of the songs centered around patriotism and conflict, because this was up close to Northern Ireland. It's right there next to the Northern Ireland border. But there was always one woman. I went there for 3 or 4 nights in a row, and there was always one woman whose name was Mary, young woman. And they would say, "Come on, Mary, give us a song. Come on, Mary, give us a song." And she'd never do it. She'd always help serve, and she'd kind of clean up some things, and she'd say, "No, no, no," and she'd go back to her business. But then one night, when there weren't so many tourists, there were just a few of us, and then the locals, they said, "Mary, give us a song." And so she kind of took her apron off, and she set some things aside, and she stood there, and everyone got silent. It took her 2 minutes maybe to finally come forward with it. But there was such a silence that what you felt was an embrace. You felt everyone holding Mary. And she began with a song. Fervata snorowella, Fervata snorowella, Fervata, O Fervata, andictu andrentu, andictur amora. She sang for about 3 minutes. The room was half in tears and half applauding, and she turned red, and she moved back to put her apron on. And I asked her later on what the song was, and the fellow next to me said, the song is called "I Longed for My Love Across the Sea." Sometimes wisdom is the art of connection. It's the art of silence and patience enough to allow the connection to surface. What's the old saying? Be kind to one another, because everyone is struggling with some great battle. Everyone is dealing with some conflict. All it takes is silence enough to wait. The art of connection allows itself to come up. Love is at the very heart of our being. It's who we are. It's who we are called to be. It just takes a little creativity, a little patience, a little artfulness. Amen.